Good morning, everyone. Okay, so any particular questions from last week on, Ecclesiastes? From things that we talked about last week? No, you don't have to go last week. I just don't want to not address something that you're like, oh, I really wanted this answer. I can't tell you how many times I was in a class and the teacher didn't cover the question I had. Man, so, yeah, story of my life.
But did you ever tell the teacher what the question was?
Oh, yeah, they just didn't have time.
Oh.
Yeah, so they had to crank through stuff really fast. So that's why I don't crank through stuff really fast. Okay, well, no questions from last week. So this week, we'll try to cover Ecclesiastes 1 through 11. And who would like to read that for us?
The words of the teacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem. Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. What do people gain from all their labors at which they toil under the sun? Generations come and generations go, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun sets and hurries back to where it rises. The wind blows to the south and turns to the north. Round and round it goes, ever returning on its course. All streams flow into the sea, yet the sea is never full. To the place the streams come from, there they return again. All things are wearisome, more than one can say. The eye never has enough of seeing, nor the ear is fill of hearing. What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which one can say, look, this is something new? It was here already, long ago. It was here before our time. No one remembers the former generations, and even those yet to come will not be remembered by those who follow them.
All right, thanks. So in those 11 verses, any particular questions you want addressed? Just shoot them out loud here. I'm trying to get to the right spot.
So in 1:4, it talks about the earth remains forever. Do you think the forever is in a comparison with generations? And or why is earth and generations compared?
Oh, okay. We can talk about that. So, forever. Amazing amount of songs that pop in your head when you say forever. Forever is the Hebrew word olam, and it doesn't have the same scope of meaning that our word forever. So we're used to time being delineated down to fractions and fractions of seconds, which are usually the smallest thing that we use in our day-to-day life here. And so if we say forever, we mean something longer than the hypothetical, however many billions of years people have said their universes existed. So forever is infinitely longer than that. But in the Hebrew Bible, forever almost never has that meaning. It just means long time. That's all it means. It's just a long time, which, again, makes sense if, you're living 50, 60 years, and then you die, then next generation 50, 60 years, and so a few hundred years pass, and it's like, well, that's a long time. So that's what forever means here. It's sometimes hard for us to realize or remember that the time period the judges existed, took place, is still longer than how long our country's been around. And we cover that in just a few short weeks in our Bible classes. And again, it's hard for us to remember that the nation of Israel existed much longer than we've been around. And then you had hundreds of years before that, and then you had the Egyptian bondage for hundreds of years, and just all these hundreds and hundreds of years. So olam just means a very long time. And that's all he's on. He's not trying to talk about an infinite duration. And so that's a modern connotation here. Okay, anybody else have anything else on 1:4? We'll talk more about it, but any other questions? Oh, yes, ma'am? Oh, okay. Did anybody else have a different translation besides hasten to rise? Hurries back here. Okay, so let me give you a possibility here that is outside our normal expectations. The way we normally think about the sun rising, the sun setting, is we go, first of all, okay, that's just a figure of speech. The sun doesn't actually move in our universe. We move around that here. But for the sake of argument, it rises and sets, and we say it's based on scientific principles that we're circling around the sun. It just appears this way, that way here. And that certainly is the case, but it's not the totality of the answer here. The sun rises and the sun sets because every day God makes sure the sun rises and the sun sets, because that's one of the things that God wants to do for us, which is in distinction from our lives. We dislike that level of repetition. If that's our whole task in life, to cause the sun to rise, to cause the sun to set, we'd be bored after a certain amount of time. And we'd want to do something different. We'd want to speed it up. We'd want to stop it. We'd just want to trade jobs with somebody else. We'd want to do something different because that seems to be our nature, that we want change, and consistency is hard for us to grasp. But that's not hard for God. God doesn't find it a burdensome or a toilsome or a worrisome task to cause the sun to rise, to cause the sun to set. He's happy to do that because he's happy to do that. And that's one of those distinctions from him versus us here. So the author isn't trying to talk about speeding it up so much. He's just trying to talk about the level of work. Marcia? All right. And that's very good. We'll talk about that a little bit more here. Mary Sue.
Verse 11 says, there's no remembrance that is old, and even those who are yet to come will not be remembered yet. Lineage was very important to their religion and culture. So it's interesting that he says that. Is he just making a generalization of non-born people?
He's making a generalization that no matter how much time passes, people forget things. So, for instance, I assume the majority of you will get this, but I happened to mention my coworkers on Friday. I said, oh, today's the Ides of March. And they're like, what? And so they didn't know, none of them. And, we had teenagers up to, late 30s, I want to say, in the office here. And so one of them had to Google it and talk about it. I'm like, okay, So based on your educational level, based on where you grew up in the timeline of America, you learn certain things, and it was just a given. Everybody learned these things. Other people don't have that, so they don't learn that, so they don't have no idea. And another generation, even they won't remember that somebody said something about Ides of March. That's right. And so they'll just move along here, and before you know it, it'll all be forgotten. And that's what he's meaning there. Over time, everything's forgotten. And while we try to hold on to things, we can only hold on to things for a certain while, and then it's still forgotten here. Any other questions? Okay, so let's start off talking about Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel. Go ahead and one of you, multiple of you, shoot out loud. Don't raise your hand. Just give me a brief synopsis of things that take place in chapter 3, chapter 4. Don't be bashful. Well, yes. Yeah, because Adam's not found anywhere else in the Bible other than 1 Chronicles chapter 1. Otherwise, he's not mentioned at all in the Old Testament. They're in the garden. They're walking with God until they don't. Okay. Anything else? They get kicked out of the garden. Cain kills Abel. Okay. Anybody on this side? Any of the 5 lone souls over here? Don't be bashful. We got a couple guys, 3 ladies, one of you. Okay. So I want you to see that we got, in both these situations, we have sin and then we have punishment. So Adam and Eve, they sin, God immediately punishes them, off they go. But with Cain and Abel, it's different. Cain sins, and Abel is punished. I don't know if you paid attention to this, but in the Old Testament, to be blessed by God meant that you had children, a long life, and wealth. When you look at Deuteronomy 7, Deuteronomy 30, those are the blessings that either are going to be bestowed upon you or withheld from you based on your relationship with God. Got a good relationship with God, you're going to have children, you're going to have a long life, and you're going to have this wealth, whatever wealth is in the terms of that society. You're going to have those things here. But Abel, he didn't get that. And he actually is called out as righteous. Adam and Eve, they're not called out as righteous in the Bible. Abel, however, is called out righteous in the Bible a number of times here. And so we have Cain who sins, but Abel who's punished. And as a matter of fact, the exact opposite seems to happen in chapter 4. Cain's the one who sins, Abel's the one who suffers, and then when Cain complains to God about how great his punishment is, what does God do? What? Yes, but what does he say? What does he do for the guy? Okay, he sets a mark on him, and then what happens because he has that mark now? People won't kill him. And then he goes off and he founds a bunch of cities. He has a long life. He has a bunch of children. So, at the very beginning, it should have been that you sin, you die, and then maybe God starts over, maybe God does whatever here. But we see right off the bat, you sin, he dies, he should have had long life children and blessings, but the guy who was evil and wicked had long life children and blessings. And so, what happened here? What went on? You don't necessarily know this, but when we talked about Hevel, that's the same spelling as Abel. Did you know that? So when Adam named his son, Abel, that's the same Hebrew word as what we have translated in Ecclesiastes as futility, meaningless, vapor, breath, smoke, enigmatic. And it is filled with a level of irony that most people never get, that his son was named that, and he was the righteous one. and everything bad happened to him. Because after all, he's the one that made a sacrifice to God. God accepted that. And because God accepted that, Cain got jealous and killed him. I mean, he did the right things all the way through. And because he did the right things, he died. Yes, ma'am? Well, so on the one hand, what Nancy's saying is true. On the other hand, it's not true. So our society has become so divorced from death. We have removed ourselves so far from death and the consequences of death that we have been forced to change death into a friend, a good thing. This is why euthanasia is on the rise. Because it's not acceptable, it's not a good thing for anybody to suffer. I can remember when I was a young teenager and I was reading a book. So I wasn't a Christian. And in this book, we went to a fantasy land and you had a character exposed to this wonderful land that was filled with life. And there were these horses that were sentient. They were just overflowing with life, and they had these people that just took care of them. And then one time, one of the horses broke its leg, and he had come from our world. He's like, why don't you put it down? It doesn't need to suffer. And the characters of the book talked about, well, no, that's not how we do things here. He's a living being. He has sentient. He has a mind. We just don't put people out of miseries here. But that's how we view things. We view things that we're a lot like animals. We should not suffer. We should, in fact, be put out of our misery and euthanized. Because that's what we view things here. In the Bible, however, suffering oftentimes has redemptive effects. And in the Bible, death is never our friend. This is why Paul says that the last enemy that the church has, the last enemy that God has, the last enemy that we have is death. And so, again, on another hand, it's important that Christians not be afraid of death. It's important that we realize that death is not the end for us, that we're going to go be with God. But on the other hand, we shouldn't be looking forward to death. That's not what God created us for. He created us for what? Life. Which is why Jesus talks about in John that I came to give you life. Life everlasting. Life eternal. Life abundantly. I want you to have life. This is why in Acts chapter 3, the irony is quoted this way, that you put to death, in chapter 3, you put to death Jesus, who is the author of life. You put to death the one who is life. How can you do that? Well, you can only do that because it's part of God's plan here. And so, Abel dying shouldn't be part of the plan. It should have been that you did the right things and you lived. But because sin came into the world, it messed everything up. And that's what Ecclesiastes really starts to explore is, okay, if everything's messed up, then why is it so messed up? Why is it that the good suffer sometimes and the wicked prosper sometimes? Why is it that I did everything right and I died, and he did everything wrong and he lived? I mean, we have in our society, except that we've removed God and we've put in place science. Why is it that this old man, who's in his 80s, who's cantankerous, obviously has a fair amount of stress, who drinks every day, smokes every day, curses every day, is thin as a rail, and he just keeps kicking along, causing grief in everybody's life? And you got some sweet lady who was busting her hump, trying to do all these wonderful things for her family, and she dies early. Where's the fairness in that? And so Ecclesiastes is trying to get us to understand that when we're young, we want life to be fair, and we're taught life should be fair. But when we get older, we realize life is not at all fair. Yes, sir. So let's go back to Ecclesiastes here. So in chapter 1, verse 3, it says, "What advantage does man have in all his work, which he does under the sun?" So in verse 2, he said, "Vanities of vanities, say the preacher, vanities of vanities, all is vanity, all is futile, all is meaningless, all is enigmatic, all is whatever your translation is." So that's his theme, and then he asked this programmatic question, which my translation says, "What advantage does man have in all his work?" Does anybody else have a different translation for 1:3? Go ahead and read it out loud if you got something different than what I read.
What do people gain from all their labors, at which they toil under the sun?
Okay. Anybody else?
Men gain by all their toil, at which they toil.
Okay. Okay. So that's the question that Solomon, or the author, what, did I spell something wrong? Okay. Okay, cool. Okay, cool. That Solomon's going to be addressing throughout the whole book. And we want to realize that there are no simple answers. Okay, it's not a math equation, 2 + 2 = 4. It's real life, and in real life, bad things happen to good things happen to bad people. In real life, the righteous suffer. In real life, the wicked sometimes are not punished. But what we want to understand is that God is still in control. And that's what we've got to get to, which is why he ends in chapter 12 about this is what we need to do is have this relationship with God, fear God, keep his commandments, for this is the whole of man. This is our purpose. This is our reason for existing, to do these things for God here. The difficulty comes in because we don't understand gain, labor, toil under the sun. So when he says what gain is there, what advantage is there, what profit does a man have, what does that mean to all of you, to any of you who want to say something?
To me, it means, yeah, there's an earthly gain, but in the end, it doesn't matter.
Okay. No value. Okay, so gains no value, no ultimate value. Ultimate
No eternal value.
value. Well, I wrote ultimate first, but eternal would fit just as fine here. Anybody else? Yes, sir. Okay. Anybody else?
Well, if the focus is God's blessings for children, long life and wealth, then the gain would be that
Okay.
it would be those blessings.
Okay. So you'll have seen or will see as you read through the book that gain, profit, value is used a number of times. And it's only used in Ecclesiastes. So we're limited on how we're going to understand it. He means by the word, it's a commercial term, best we can determine, and he means by it something extra, something that's surplus. So it's not so much that you got some advantage or return on the work that you did, but that you have a bunch of extra for the work that you did here. So what advantage, what gain do we get from all our labor? And the answer is what? What'd you say?
Pleasing God if we use it to His glory. If I work hard and earn money, and I use my money to God's glory, to me that's not earthly gain, but that's eternal gain.
But the verse says, what advantage does man have in all his work which he does under the sun? So the answer was again, what advantage did we have for all our work under the sun?
It's not my gain, it's God's gain.
Okay. So we certainly can try to do a level of spiritualization, and there is a certain sense in which that is true here, but Ecclesiastes isn't wanting that at the moment here. So what is he wanting us to say to this question? Earl? He's wanting us to say there is no advantage. There is no advantage. And we can see the truth in that by Cain and Abel. Abel did the work. He did the right things. He's dead. Okay. Cain did the work. He didn't do the right things, and he's dead. Okay. Adam, dead. Eve, dead. You know, in a short period of time, within another generation, majority of people won't recognize those names at all because they just won't be exposed to the Bible as literature in any sort of way, so they won't even know who these people are anymore. They'll just be forgotten. So Solomon is saying that, well, what advantage these people do? What was extra that their work enabled them to do? Abel did all this stuff, and he got no extra. He still died. Cain didn't do all that stuff, and he still died. So what's the purpose of all working? What's the purpose of all doing these things under the sun? What do we actually gain? And he talks about our labor or our work, our toil. So those should go together here. And you do want to see that that's a more negative than neutral term here. And yet, that's a term that's used a bunch of times in Ecclesiastes. Did anybody notice that? He talks a lot about work. He talks a lot about our toil. And as he talks, oh, yes, sir? Do you want to say something? Well, go ahead and read it for us. Okay, so we understand, go over here, we understand that Abel, because he did the right things, Matthew 16, he gained eternal life with God. I'm going to make the assumption, I think I can prove it, but there's no verse that says that Adam and Eve, they have eternal life with God. Cain, not so much. I could be wrong on that, but at least the Bible portrays him in a negative thing throughout his whole life. So of these four, I think I make a good case that he doesn't have a positive outcome. But that's not what Ecclesiastes is concerned about. Ecclesiastes is not concerned about our eternal destiny. He is not saying, what ultimate gain do you get from serving God? He actually says, what profit is there from all your labor? What advantage do we have from doing all these things under the sun? Because he wants us to think about our life and realize something about our life here. And uh-huh. Uh, Go ahead.
I'll be taking you to another subject, but I was teaching at a camp. It was December the 7th, and I asked a bunch of 10-year-olds, what's important about this day? They said, nothing. I said, where's there a day that we remember? And he said, yeah, the Alamo. And I thought they could remember back hundreds of years, but they couldn't remember what just happened, in a lifetime. That was strange, that how soon we forget things. And I don't know, this part of Ecclesiastes. We toil for the sins forgotten.
Let me ask a deeper question. Oh, Earl, go ahead.
You said that in the Old Testament, the blessings, the thought was children, long life, and wealth. I see him challenging that mentality, that wealth is nothing, just vanity, and long life is vanity. And so we almost need to take our mind out of to understand this, out of the Christian environment and look at it from their point of view of what he's trying to say in their mentality that, well, hey, what do you mean my toil is, I gain wealth? Well, it's vanity to have wealth. And so I think that's what he's trying to get across to his audience.
Let me ask you guys a different question here. Hypothetically speaking, if all of you lived a 100% righteous life and you never sinned, what gain would there be? That's the correct answer. Because that is God's due. It's the bare minimum that we live a perfect life. We didn't do anything extra by living a perfect life. Okay? So that's what we're supposed to do, is not sin. But we can't even do that here. So when Solomon says, what advantages are to all our work, what extra did we set aside, like that parable of the man with all his barns, what extra did we set aside? There is nothing extra we set aside here. And he wants us to understand that for all our labor, for all our toil, that there really is no gain, nothing extra. If we are sinless, well, God says we just have done what we're supposed to do. We have done the work God has given us. As he says, we've done this. We've not done anything extra that God has said for us to do here. Yes, ma'am?
So just clarification. So the gain.
Don't pin me down. No, go ahead.
The gain, the labor, and the toil, it's not so much talking about what do we have to gain, but what God is gaining from our actions.
Well, no, it is what we have to gain. But what I want you to understand is that even if we lived perfect, we don't gain anything. Because that's what God said, live perfect. So if we did everything right, we didn't do anything that enables us to get anything extra out of life. Because this is what we're supposed to do. Sharon? Well, I saw him. I jumped over Wade to jump to you because I like you more. But I'll go back to Wade. So don't misunderstand me. So this is why Ecclesiastes is avoided by everybody, because it's just a lot of hard work. So this is why we spent a whole class talking about the ultimate point is in chapter 12. But he starts off in chapter 1. He asks this question because he wants you to think. Have you ever considered the question the psalmist asks over in Psalm 8, which is quoted in the New Testament? What is man that you take thought of him, and the son of man that you care for him? What is man that we have any value in the eyes of God? I want us, and this is something you want to pay attention to, I want us to come to realize that we are creatures. And we have limitations. And these are God-given. We have absorbed wholeheartedly our mentality from our society that we can be anything we want, that we can go past our limitations. And we have all sorts of anecdotal evidence that we can get better and better and better and better, which is why we love sports. Because every few years, records fall. Every few years, a human being runs faster than anybody has ever run before. And it just keeps getting faster and faster and faster. And people get bigger and bigger, stronger and stronger, better and better, smarter and smarter, and do all these things, and we think we can go past our limitations. And if we can go past our limitations, well, then we don't need to worry about this existence because we're limited by our body. And so we put all our trust in health. We can go past our limitations, that we can no longer require a woman to have a baby. That we can avoid that limitation of a womb. That we can avoid limitation of having a man and a woman create a child. That we can avoid limitation of, and you fill in the blank. This is what our society has taught us. But what the Bible teaches us, and what Ecclesiastes wants us to understand, is that we are creatures. We are part of the creation, and we have limitations, and these are God-given limitations. It's not a bad thing to be limited. We have, however, taken our limitations and converted it into a bad thing. I don't know everything. I can't do everything. And I feel bad. I feel bad when I have to make a decision and I don't know the right decision to make. And of course, our society doesn't help the matters out. Oh, if you just got enough information, if you just talk to the right person, you will get the right answer. There is a right answer. And yet, we understand, especially this audience, we have all kinds of medical issues. And there are not right answers. The doctors just straight up and say, I don't know. You know, doctors just have a lot in common with your car mechanic. You bring your car in, it's making some strange noise. Guy's like, take it out for a test drive, makes no noise. You're like, well, it does it when I drive. So then you have to spend forever trying to get the right time when the guy can actually hear the noise and say, oh, okay, I hear the noise. I think it's this. Great, you got it solved. It doesn't work. Take it back a couple weeks later, got the problem. Take it back a couple weeks later. And he keeps going trial and error, and eventually he might get it, or eventually he might determine and say, you know what, I think you might have got a lemon, and we just can't actually fix it. Well, that's the way it is with our bodies, and that's the way it is with things. But in our mind, our society has taught us that we should be able to do better. We should have all the answers. We should have the right answers. And then in the church, we have made it even worse because we've said, oh, it's obvious there's a right and a wrong. There's just a right way and a wrong way. And in one sense, that's true. Trusting God is always the right answer. But in another way, it's not true, as can be seen if you've ever sat in with a group of men trying to make a decision. There's not a clarity of thought that's universal among men about we should do this. Should we give money to this person or to this person? Or not to any person at all? There's not this clarity that there's a right answer, a wrong answer. And the reason that's true is because we are creatures and God has given us our limitations. But we don't want to accept those. We don't want to accept that we need sleep. We don't want to accept that we can't do everything. We don't want to accept that we're going to die. We don't want to accept these things because we think we can do better than that. And yet, when you look at verses 4 through 11, the author says, a generation goes, which of course, is not the way we say it. We say a generation comes, a generation goes. But already he's starting to prejudice towards death. A generation goes, dies, and then a generation comes. But the earth remains forever. So group people rise, group people die. So what? Sun is still there. The sun rises and the sun sets and hastens to its place. It rises there again. The sun just keeps doing its thing, regardless of how many nations have risen or fall, how many nuclear wars we may or may not have, how many global warming events we're going to have, how many ice ages. It doesn't matter. The sun still does its thing. Blowing toward the south and turning toward the north, the winds continue swirling along. On its circular course, the winds return. All the rivers flow into the sea. Yet the sea is not full. To the place where the rivers flow, they flow again. All things are wearisome. Man is not able to tell it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor is the ear filled with hearing. That which has been is that which will be, and that which has done is that which will be done. So there's nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which one might say, see this, it's new? Already has existed for ages, which were before us. There is no remembrance of earlier things, and also the latter things which will occur. There will be for them no remembrance among those who will come later still. So the author makes the point that we have all these cycles of life. The universe just runs on these cycles, and it runs on these cycles because God's in control, and he causes it so. And one of those cycles is us. And the cycle is we born, we live, we die. Yes, ma'am?
To me, this goes back to Genesis 3.
Yes.
Verse 7, what?
Yes, everything goes back to Genesis 1 through 3. So.
Verse 17, where he says, cursed is the ground because of you. In painful toil you will eat food from it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow you will eat your food until you return to the ground. Then from it you were taken, for thence you are. To me, this goes back to Genesis, where God says,
It is. One author I read had this quote, if we won't live forever, or even long enough to make a lasting difference to the world, how then should we live? Verses 1 through 11 are pointing us to accept our death and learn to live based on our death, which is why we name this class Living Backwards. If we're going to die, then how should we live? If death is our ultimate destiny, then how should we live? If no matter what we do, no matter what we create, no matter what we discover, it's not going to have the lasting value of impacting the whole universe, then what should we do? I mean, we suffer under the assumption that everything we do in this time frame is brand new. That nobody else discovered the things that we have discovered. Which is why it's always a kick in the pants when you have some archaeologist who finally deciphers some language from some culture and they find out that they had a mathematical system or astronomy to this level that's more accurate than what we use today. It's like, well, how could they possibly do that? Because we, again, operate under the assumption that everybody outside of this time frame lived in the dark ages. And by dark, we meant ignorance / stupidity, because they just didn't know anything at all. And yet, if you talk to them one-on-one, we can show that's not true, but we still have that operating assumption here. And we think that's all that's really important in life is what's taking place now. and only things that take place now have any value, but that's not true. If we're going to die, then how should we live? If we're going to give up the ghost, if we're going to pass away, if we're going to expire, if we're going to use whatever euphemism we have about somebody dying, then how should we live? The answer is what Kenny was talking about in Matthew 16, that we should live for God. We should live for Christ. We should trust in Him. But you can only trust in Him if you really believe that you're a creature of limitations. So I'll pick on my wife. We have a number of kids, have all kinds of medical issues, and there is no clarity among anybody about anything. I am an individual who does not suffer from regret. I'm willing to admit that I don't know something sometimes, and I'm willing to move on from my mistakes and just say, okay, chalk it up. You know, I ordered the wrong thing, I paid for the wrong thing, I did the wrong thing. Let's move on here. My wife operates on the assumption that there is a right answer, and we can find it if we just spend enough time, if we just work hard enough. And it is hard for her to say, I don't know. Because she can look in her life, and what she thinks about are not all the right decisions she has made. She doesn't say, see, I was right here, here, and here. All she can say is, well, I regret this. That was a wrong decision. Because 20 years later, I have clarity of thought, and this is the right answer. I should have done that then, but I didn't. I'm pond scum. We just don't accept that we have limitations. We have got to accept we have limitations, because when you have limitations, then all you have left is trust in God. Because we just can't do everything. We think we can do everything. We think if we are farmers, that we get the seed, we plant the seed, we water the seed, take care of the seed, we're all good. Except, of course, what happens? Rain comes too early, rain comes too late, tornado comes along, thunderstorm this, early freeze, late freeze. I mean, boy, you listen to farmers, and it's like every year something bad happened to them, and you wonder how the earth has ever survived. Well, it's because God's in charge. God takes control. God works these things out. Let me read you a quote here from an author. So just a second, let me get to it here. So he says, the reality is we spend our lives trying to escape the constraints of our created condition. Opening our eyes to this is a significant breakthrough. To be human is to be a creature, and to be a creature is to be finite. We are not God. We are not in control, and we will not live forever. We will die. But we avoid this reality by playing let's pretend. Let's pretend that if we get that promotion, or see our church grow, or bring up good children, we'll feel significant and leave a lasting legacy behind us. Let's pretend that if we change jobs or immigrate to the sun, we won't experience the humdrum tedium and ordinariness of life. Let's pretend that if we move house, we'll be happier and we'll never want to move again. Let's pretend that if we end one relationship and start a new one, we won't ever feel trapped. Let's pretend that if we were married or weren't married, we'd be content. Let's pretend that if we had more money, we would be satisfied. Let's pretend that if we get through this week's pile of washing and dirty nappies and shopping lists and school runs and busy evenings, next week will be quieter. Let's pretend that time is always on our side to do the things we want to do and become people we want to be. Let's pretend we can break the cycle of repetition and finally arrive in a world free from weariness. Ecclesiastes is saying, stop pretending. You can't do that. You can't break through the cycle of things here. We're just going to live. We're going to suffer. We're going to have some good things. We're going to have some bad things, and we're going to die. The only difference between anybody is whether we're going to trust God with our life or not trust God with our life. That's it. Good things happen to bad people. Bad things happen to good people. There's no rhyme or reason that we can perceive. We can see little small things. We can say, if you do these things, 9 times out of 10, good things will happen. If you do these things, 9 times out of 10, bad things will happen. But that's not how we live our life. I remember when I started working for a large company, and they did a lot of offshore drilling platforms. They constructed massive platforms to drill out in the middle of the ocean, seas, wherever. And they had a culture of safety. Well, I've never been exposed to safety. And so the very first day, they give you orientation about safety, and here's what they say. They say to people, every 300 unsafe acts will result in 30 consequences. So you do something 300 times, about 30 times you'll get some sort of consequence. Case in point, we have a warehouse. I walk fast, at least faster than everybody else at work. And sometimes I don't watch where I'm going, and sometimes they'll have something sticking out. So I have scraped my leg twice walking through that warehouse, and I've walked through that warehouse hundreds of times. Okay, so every 30 times something will happen, but out of those 30 times something happened, 3 of those times will be really serious, which means that, somebody got damaged enough to need to go to the doctor, and 1 of those times will be ultimately serious. So in the 5 years I worked there, we had 2 deaths because of these things here. But we live our life thinking nothing bad is ever going to happen to us because we just think we're the exception. We're the exception if we go faster than the speed limit requires. We're not going to get a ticket. We're the exception if we go slower. Nothing bad's going to happen to us. We're the exception if we always do this or we don't always do this or we this or that or whatever. We're just an exception. This is why majority of people think they are better than what? Average. Some people have an ego, think they're the best of the best. But most of us have a level of humility, and we say we're just better than average. We're not on the low end, because we don't want to be the low end. But we don't think we're at the top end, we're just better than average. And we say that, well, I'm better than average driver. I'm better than average at this game or this activity or this or that, And how we've determined that, I don't know. We just shoot from the hip and say we're better than average here. Ecclesiastes 1-11 says, all these cycles of life are going through here, and you have no control over it. Because you have no control over it, you need to realize you have limitations. Because you have limitations, you've just got to accept that we are going to die, and if we're going to die, the question is, what are we going to do? Are we going to trust in God or not trust in God? Okay, I got through 11 verses. I think somebody else had a question about one verse that maybe I didn't answer. Was there a verse? No, not really. I always thought that verse 8 was really good. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor is the ear filled with hearing. Humanity, we just want new things. We just always think if we have something new, it'll be better. And if it's better, it'll be better for us. I've always told my family that we have all these problems, and if we had more money, that would take care of these problems, but all that would mean is they would fall off your list of problems, and a bunch more would all of a sudden pop up. If all of a sudden I got my children to act appropriately, well, then I'd be concerned about this. If all of a sudden I got this resolved, then I'd be concerned about this. We have an infinite level of problems that we just don't have the scope of mentality to comprehend. We can only focus on a few things, and if we take care of those things, they drop off our list, and new things just roll into it all the time. There's an infinite level of problems, which is why we just need to trust God. Yes, sir.
And I think God brings things into our life to cause us to trust in Him.
Amen. I believe that 100%, that God is concerned about each and every one of us. We, again, have a tendency to think of God like ourselves. I can only focus on a few things at a time. I can only give my attention to one person at a time. I can only look at one person at a time in the eyes. I can peripheral vision see people, but that's not going to work here. So we think God's that way, that if I pray to God and God is answering my prayers, He's focused on me, which means He's not focused on anybody else. Now, of course, we know God can multitask, so we think, oh, he can take care of these other things. But God is infinite. He can give us his undivided attention to every individual on earth, and he does that all the time. He is watching over everybody. He is intimately concerned with every aspect of our life. As Christians, we believe, the Bible teaches that God dwells inside us. So there is no pain that we experience that God has not experienced. And we like to say, well, God's perfect. He can't look at sin. He doesn't experience these things. But that's not true. He sees us. We are sinners. So he can see sin. He lives with us, and we live with pain. He feels pain. We should understand that from Jesus. He suffered. He experienced pain. He experienced disappointment. He experienced all kinds of things, a lot of things that we don't really comprehend what he experienced. So if God is with us and he's concerned about us, then we just got to trust him. And he's going to work in our lives because he has all power. If he doesn't want us to trip over this pavement right over here, he'll prevent that. Now, a lot of times he doesn't do things in our lives because he just lets us do what we're going to do because we're living our life. But there are plenty of times when he does intervene that we just don't recognize. Any of you ever had a near miss while driving? Of course you have. You can't live. It's like, oh! You know, and it's like, man, if I just been a fraction of a second slower or something else happened, I'd be dead or seriously wounded or whatever here. God watches over us all the time, and we have got to trust that and believe that, which is what the Bible says. I mean, all the Bible tells us a story about God taking care of all kinds of people, and it's all meant to generate our faith and trust in God, because at the end of the day, that's all we have. We're never going to understand why this person died, this person lived. We're never going to understand why this person got rich, this person got poor. We're never going to understand why these bad things had to happen to this person, and nothing bad seemed to happen to this person. We are not going to comprehend that. But we know God does, and we know God has love for all of humanity. God is love, and if he loves us, he is concerned about us. He wants what is best for each and every one of us. Then we have just got to trust that, which again goes back to reading the Bible. Think about what Solomon says. What advantage is there in all our labor? Well, there's no advantage. There's no extra. We just need to trust God, which is what he ends in chapter 12. Trusting God. Okay, so next week we will start in chapter 1, verse 12, and I'm not sure how far we'll get. We'll get at least through chapter 1, maybe in part of chapter 2. Class dismissed.